And welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast. I am your host, Wayne Mulder, and I'm excited to be back with you again this week. This is the 110th episode of the podcast, so thank you very much to those of you who've been following along on this journey, and thank you to the new listeners who have just come. In fact, last week's episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to the morning roll call. It's a good one to listen to if you haven't listened to previous episodes, because it will tell you who I am, it will tell you what we're doing, and it will tell you a little bit about what you can expect to find on the site. So, few orders of business, if you would forgive me. Last week I mentioned that I have the ebook out. It's just a small ebook, 40 pages, 30 pages, depending on which format you get it in. It's not going to take you very long to read it. It's called How Law Enforcement Makes You Cynical and What You Can Do About It. It's my journey. Mentions a few things that I have seen when it comes to cynicism in law enforcement, and then a few things that I've done to combat it myself. Check it out. See what you think. The nice thing is, for right now, for the month of August, it's going to change at the end of August. But for the month of August, it is still free. And how you can get it is you can click the links in the notes. You can go to the website at ontheblueline.com. You do have to enter an email, but if you enter the email, then you will get a free download of the book that you can read at your leisure. So I encourage you to do that. So today, what I want to do is I'm going to start with talking about crises and the different crises that we're hearing. So we have a lot of absolute craziness going on. So I thank you for coming and listening to the show and pulling up a front row seat to the end of Western civilization, because I think that is where we're at. But we will try to make it as enjoyable as we possibly can as we watch the dumpster fire that is Western civilization. To that end, let me talk about a couple crises that have been mentioned in recent weeks. So, depending on when you're listening to this, this is going to come out the second week of August, and you'll have to forgive me. We're running about 3 weeks behind when these incidents happened, just from a scheduling standpoint. I'm hoping to change that over time. In fact, the long-term goal is that this would be a daily show and you would get the information in real time, so don't have these huge delays. But for right now, I have to schedule it out if you're going to get the material, so we have to work together when it comes to that. So back in July, on July 19th, there was a press briefing, and Miss Jean Pierre is speaking here, and she says, quote, "So this is something that's incredibly important to the president." So what they're talking about, the this in that sentence, is the quote-unquote climate crises. So this is something, quoting again, incredibly important to the president. He thinks it is. It is urgent to act on the climate crisis, to take action. And that's why if Congress, Senate, doesn't act on the climate component of reconciliation, he is ready to use his executive authority, which, of course, is his non-constitutional authority, which, that's a whole different conversation as to his just complete disregard for the Constitution that this entire administration has, and they've completely lost their minds. But that's not the point of this conversation. In fact, it's not really to discuss these issues. It's only to lay some groundwork for where I'm really going with this. On the 20th, she then is talking again, and she says, all right, quoting, okay, I have a few things at the top. Speaking of climate change, so we are closely monitoring the extreme heat conditions impacting much of Europe, as well as the extreme heat impacting the more than 100 million Americans who are struggling with extreme, I think we're using that word extreme quite a bit in this. But anyway, I digress, quoting again, extreme heat conditions here at home just this week alone. The impacts of extreme weather are intensifying across the globe, including here in the United States. No one is immune from climate change. No one. It's why the president has been rallying the world to take decisive action needed in this decade to tackle the climate change, the climate crisis. It's also why the president is committed to taking aggressive action to tackle climate change. It made it clear that if the Senate won't act, he will, end of quote, he will act, all right, yes, unconstitutionally. He will just completely, if the legislative branch will not do it, I will step in as dictator-in-chief and handle it. That's essentially what he's saying. But what I find interesting is then on the 20th, there was a follow-up question, and this is coming from a reporter. And y'all forgive me, I do not have the reporter's name in front of me, but if you follow the notes, you can pull it up in the press briefing on the White House site. So the link, you can follow the link in the show notes. So just quoting, just a quick one on the climate emergency and public health emergency. So in quote, there's a couple things going on here, right? So you have this climate crisis emergency, and it's due to what is clearly the extreme heat, not to be confused with the seasonality. It is summertime. But anyway, it'll be extreme cold when winter gets here. But that's just kind of the way these things go. Anyway, this reporter is also bringing up the other emergency that we happen to have, which is a public health emergency, in her words, and in the White House's words. So I quote again, "How concerned is the White House it may end up sort of angering female voters if it does not sort of go ahead and announce a climate emergency ahead of a public health emergency, considering we haven't seen such an announcement after Roe? Is that maybe why the timing?" End quote. And then Miss Jean Pierre comes back and says, "No, I wouldn't make that into an issue. Both of those things are still on the table. We just haven't announced them or made a decision yet. I just laid out what the difference is between when you look at a public health emergency on the abortion side and when you look at a public health emergency more on the abortion side, but the difference between the two. They're both on the table. We just haven't made an announcement on that yet," end quote. So a few things. First of all, as you should know by now, every time the word emergency is used and every time we have the conversation about safety, your rights are being diminished. That's pretty much where we're at. I don't know if you haven't got that figured out yet after the last few years. There's not a whole lot more I can do for you, whether you're listening to my show or not. But that's neither here nor there for the conversation I want to have. Because we have these made-up emergencies, right? So you have the climate emergency where essentially we're using that as the Trojan horse to push through more larger government control. And there's all sorts of very, very, very bad things that will come from that, including their attack on free speech, it is just non-ending with what that door opens. And then the same would be true for the public health emergency. And listen, it really doesn't matter where you fall on the Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court gave the power back to the states, which is where it belonged. So calling it a public health emergency is laughable at best. It didn't stop any state from going ahead and codifying anything that they feel is necessary. So we're not even going to get into that debate or that conversation right here. The only point, which is a constitutional point, is that there is no public health emergency anymore, that there is a climate crisis emergency. These are more made-up emergencies that are helping to push a narrative and helping to give control to some people who are clearly out of control. But that's not, again, the point of this conversation. What I want to talk about is the real crisis, right? So we have all these crises, all these things that people are like, oh my goodness, the sky is falling, chicken little, everything is gone crazy. And the reality is we have a real crisis. We have a real crisis in this country. We have a worldwide crisis. And that is a mental health crisis. Let me start with speaking globally. And when I say globally, I mean in the broader public. And so let me start with some larger stats for you. And then I'm going to start zeroing in specifically to law enforcement. And then I'm going to end with a little madness. So you're going to want to stick through to the end when I can tell you where people have lost their ever-loving minds. So according to Discover Magazine, and again, all these links are going to be in the show notes so you can check out these stats. But they say that at least 700,000 people die each year, according to the World Health Organization. In the U.S., well over 45,000 people have become victims annually of suicide. That's more than the yearly count of deaths from breast cancer, leukemia, or prostate cancer. These numbers fit into a concerning trend. Americans are now killing themselves at a rate 30% higher than just 20 years ago. 2002. 20 years ago, we are 30% higher than those numbers. At some point, we have to start asking ourselves why, right? There has to be, yes, we have a mental health crisis, and maybe it's time that we start asking ourselves some serious questions and But more on that as I get to where I'm going with this in the end. The writers of this say that the broader factors driving the uptick over the past 2 decades are vast and complicated. And they go on to the strongest risk factor is someone who's attempted suicide previously, which we know. That's why there's so many things in place that law enforcement and mental health counselors try to intervene early on to keep that from occurring. In another study, this one speaking of anxiety and depressive disorders, this is coming from the Global Cognitive Neuroscience Market Grow. As per the World Health Organization, anxiety and depressive disorders are the most prevalent mental disorders, affecting 1 in 8 persons or 970 million people worldwide in 2019. On account of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm quoting there, but I would insert, on account of the insane response to the COVID-19 pandemic, my own words, the percentages of persons who suffer from anxiety and depression illnesses increased from 26% to 28% in 2020. And then it goes on to, in 2019, 301 million people, including 58 million children and adolescents, suffered from an anxiety disorder and so forth. And I'll get a little bit deeper into that here in a moment. This study, coming from the World Health Organization, I found kind of interesting. COVID-19 pandemic triggers 25% increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide. And then it goes on to talk about a wake-up call to countries to step up mental health services and support. 25%, 1 in 4. That is an insane increase. Concerns about potential increases in mental health conditions had already prompted 90% of countries surveyed to include mental health and psychosocial support and so forth. But 25% increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression. Recently, in just this last weekend, and like I said, when you're listening to this, that'll actually have been 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago, there was an article that ran in the Chicago Sun-Times. And another sad article, and I'm getting sick of reading these headlines, as I'm sure you are as well, and having personally known a few fellow officers take their lives. This is always a tough conversation and a tough thing to talk about. But after 3 suicides by Chicago police officers, top cop fends off rising criticism for routinely canceling days off. And, I think that's part of it. There is certainly an argument. In fact, I was recently talking to a friend of mine, and it's ironic. You go to about any law enforcement training. In fact, I talk about this in my ebook, How Law Enforcement Makes You Cynical. So you talk about, you go to any law enforcement training, and one of the key things that they talk about is this whole thing that, you need to get plenty of rest. You need to get plenty of sleep. Shift work is horrible for you. The number of hours you work, you need to spend more time with family. You need more downtime. When you're off, you need to decompress. All these things that are all true, but you're going to hear them over and over and over and over again when you talk about mental health and law enforcement. And yet, inevitably, you hear these kind of stories with, well, due to manpower, well, due to this, well, due to that, well, due to this, which, by the way, those things aren't going to get any better. If you've read some of my recent blogs, the statistics and the future is a little bleak right now. And since they're not going to get any better, you have to ask yourself, what are we going to do as a profession to get officers the time off that they need, to get them the resources that they need? A lot of times, I think it's great. Certain organizations will move towards all these different peer support and different things that they have for the officers. But then inevitably you end up with this kind of thing that, sorry, we got to hold you over because we have a manpower issue, or there's mandatory overtime in the jail because we have a manpower issue, or whatever the case may be. Those things don't compute. You know this is creating a problem. You have to deal with the problem. And I get that it's not always an easy answer. I get that these answers don't happen overnight. I get that there's a time you have to do what you have to do. I understand all of these things. But at the end of the day, we have to, as a profession, think long and hard on what we're going to do long term to keep these tragic, tragic events. So essentially, Chicago had lost 3 officers to suicide in a very short period of time. When you read through this article, another stat that's equally as concerning is 20 sworn Chicago police officers have died from suicide since 2018. including the 4 this year. In 2007, so there was a total of 4, 3 in very recent weeks. In 2017, a report by the U.S. Department of Justice found the department's suicide rate was 60% higher than the national average. And I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons again. We talk about the hours and so forth that we're working, but we also know Chicago is a very tough city. We see the homicide rates and the numbers that come out of Chicago, and we know intuitively that there is a problem there in that city and the way it's ran. And so, these things all feed together, and there's no easy answers. So there was a study in October of 2020, prevalence of mental illness and mental health care use among police officers. So this was a study where they essentially had done a survey. So what is the prevalence of mental illness and mental health care use among police officers at a large urban police department? And this was the findings. In the survey, and I'm quoting here, study of 434 police officers, 12% had a lifetime mental health diagnosis, and 26% reported current symptoms of mental illness. So again, we have these exorbitantly high figures. 26% had current symptoms of a mental illness, according to this study. And if you want to know, and it's an important portion, is to kind of know what the determination was. So here's the metric. Quoting, officers reported lifetime or current diagnosis of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as current mental health symptoms using validated screeners of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation or self-harm. So that's, when we say 26%, that's where that number's coming from. It's ones that were using validated screeners of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation or self-harm. 26% at one agency. Another article, this one from the Washington Times. This one with the headline of Biden silent on increase in police suicides while advocates urge more action and less anti-cop rhetoric. And you've read and seen some of the many things that I've written on this, that the anti-cop rhetoric certainly does play an absolute part with these tragedies. The article goes on to say, and I'm quoting, suicide has quietly become an epidemic among the nation's police, ranking as the number one cause of officer deaths this year. The number one cause of officer deaths this year is from suicide. Frustrated police advocates and mental health experts warn that President Biden has not only ignored the crisis, but has also exasperated it with his anti-police rhetoric. Yeah, well, he's exasperated quite a few problems this year, but we will leave that alone in this current conversation. So the 64 reported suicides account for 32% of the 197 officer deaths this year, higher than any other category of line of duty deaths. Still quoting, this year 34 officers have been killed by gunfire, most of them while making an arrest. 58 have died of COVID-19, and another 30 died in traffic accidents. In 2021, suicide accounted for about 20% of all known police officer deaths, and the rise in officer suicides comes as the national suicide rate declined by 3%. So we have a problem, right? And we have a mental health problem, and we have a true mental health crisis. And exactly what we do about it, I don't know. That it's, it requires a comprehensive approach. I can tell you that part of it is having real conversations, and that's kind of where I'm going with the next two articles. I'm going to read you some absolutely bizarre articles that had my attention drawn to. Well, one article, and before I read that article, this just came out, and this just came out today, and the National Review had mentioned it in their site. But it was also Twitter. Matt Walsh had put it out. Merriam-Webster now offers a second definition of a female, having a gender identity that is opposite of a male. So the second definition of female, it's no longer based on, the sex, and that typically has the capacity to bear young or produce eggs. It also has, and quote, having a gender identity that is the opposite of a male. And then, of course, they added the second definition of male, which is having, quote, a gender identity that is the opposite of female. So if you're a male that feels pretty, you could be technically a female based on this definition from a dictionary, which allegedly, and we know over the last few years that they are no longer, you can't even trust a dictionary to be accurate. That's how bad we've gotten with disinformation by the very people who keep screaming about disinformation. But I digress. So there was an article in Wired magazine, and I'm going to read you the title, and I'm going to read you a few things in this. And it's so bizarre, I don't even know what to say. This came out July 11th, 2022, so this year, just a few weeks ago. Quote, the climate anxiety discussion has a whiteness problem. You heard me right. I did read that correctly. Quote, the climate anxiety discussion has a whiteness problem. Marginalized groups, this is the subtitle, marginalized groups often think about the mental impact of the climate crisis in different terms, meaning they end up crowded out of the conversation. It goes on in its absolute insanity to Sarah Jaquette Ray, who this is about, has spent her career etching out an academic niche at the intersection of environmental issues and social justice. So clearly an expert, clearly. Quoting again, in the late 2010s, as concern around the climate crisis finally began to swell towards today's crescendo, Ray, a professor of environmental studies at California State Polytechnic University, turned her focus towards a relatively new phenomenon that had entered the discourse: climate anxiety, the chronic fear of environmental doom. As Ray began to write and talk about climate anxiety, she very quickly noticed that the people interested in her work shifted. What happened, she asked. It got a lot whiter, she says. A growing discomfort prompted her to pen an opinion piece. Well, that's about all you could do in this subject matter is an opinion piece, because there is zero factual evidence to support any of it. But anyway, I digress. A growing discomfort prompted her to pen an opinion piece for Scientific American in March of 2021, in which she expressed concern about what she dubbed as the unbearable whiteness of the climate anxiety conversation. In her words, she was sounding the alarm that if marginalized people continued to be left out of the discussion, climate anxiety would manifest as fear or anger against marginalized communities, and society would forgo the intersectional approach needed to take action against the climate crisis. End quote. This absolute insanity goes on and on and on and on, and pretty much talks about somehow this becomes a racist issue and a whiteness issue, and on it goes. But then in the end, she does end on an optimistic note. And it says, quote, but Ray and Ray, because there's another person that comes into this conversation, reserve optimism and that the conversation will continue to evolve and that it will increasingly recognize and address its own privilege. One of the things that can happen is we have a much more robust conversation about all the emotions that people who are actually experiencing climate change are feeling, says Ray. But at the same time, she believes we shouldn't reject climate anxiety as an all-encompassing category for thinking about the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. As a tool for mobilizing people to respond to climate change, it's actually very effective, she says, end quote. And that is the end of this fabulous article. And if you want to read that fabulous article, I will be sure to have the show notes in there, or have that link in the show notes so that you can waste at least 10 minutes of your time reading that. So I want to end with this point. So I want to end with a couple points. So first of all, we have a real crisis. It's not this so-called health crisis that we are making up this time. Again, because we like to make up crises, because we have found what unlimited power we end up with when we do this. And it's nothing new. I'm sure someone's like, oh, well, you're saying, this current president's doing something other presidents have done. Absolutely. And it's been wrong almost every single time. So, whether we're talking George Bush or we're talking Franklin Roosevelt or we're talking Woodrow Wilson, yeah. I am no respecter of persons in this regard. They are all wrong, and they are all overstepping constitutional authority. But that's really, again, not the point. The point is that there is not a climate crisis and that there is not a health crisis. I mean, there will be a climate crisis and there will be a health crisis, but they will be caused by the actions that they are doing under the guise of trying to deal with a climate crisis in just some weird round thinking. But anyway, what we do have is a mental health crisis. We have it at a society level. We have it, and it's going into subgroups, and subgroups such as the law enforcement profession, which is why I wanted to bring it up in this show. We have a mental health crisis on our hands, and we have to, as a profession, some agencies are rock stars. They are forward thinking. They're on the cutting edge. They're getting these there's peer support groups, there's crisis intervention teams. They have all these different resources, and they're getting it out to the officers, and they are actually living what they preach. They're saying, hey, listen, you need to take time off. You need to decompress. They're dealing with the supervisors. Hey, keep an eye, talk to them, have these conversations, let them know these resources are there. But I'm telling you, every single agency in this country needs to do that. That shouldn't be one here, one there. There's always this conversation, right, when we talk about law enforcement. Why are they so divided? Why do you have all these little agencies? Well, that is wonderful. We want that, right? We don't want a national police force. In fact, don't even get me started on federal police forces. I'm not even going to go down that road right now before I upset a lot of people. But from just a constitutional American perspective, we want all these agencies. However, when you have all these agencies, one thing we need to make sure is that these kind of resources are available to them, because a very small agency in the middle of nowhere Midwest may not have them at their disposal, and they may not have the same level of training and the same level of people to reach out to and so forth. So we need to make sure, especially those that are coming into the space and offering resources, that we are able to get them somehow, and there's always a cost associated, I get that, but get them to all officers across the U.S. at all these different agencies, no matter the size. So that is probably number one. Number two, I think there needs to be an ongoing conversation as a profession on what do we do differently, and what do we do, like this crisis we're in Chicago. What do we do with our brothers and sisters in blue to make sure that we're not only getting these resources to them, but that some of these other systematic issues, such as the manpower issues, what is our long-term plan? We need to have a long-term plan, because I can tell you it's coming. I just spoke about it last week, and I just wrote an article about it, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but we have a manpower shortage, as anyone in this career knows, and it is only probably going to get worse from what you're seeing, which leads me to my third and final point for this episode. We as a society, specifically American society. To be clear, when I talk about society, I'm not talking about it from a global perspective. In fact, I really don't give a rat's hind end what any place else is doing. When I speak about society, I'm talking about American society, because we are not a global country. We are an American country, founded on American ideals. So, again, that's what we're going to talk about. So when we talk about society, what are we going to do? Because if we keep allowing this insanity and delusion, specifically the last two articles I read, these insanity and delusion to rule, it is not going to help with the mental health crisis. In fact, I would make an argument that it is fueling the mental health crisis. Certainly the lockdowns had a lot to do with it. Certainly the government overstep had a lot to do with it. But this complete insanity and delusion that's going on, to where we are accepting things as fact when they are clearly wrong, where we are calling good evil and evil good, that's kind of just absolute accepting debauchery as the norm. I mean, it's just insanity is what it is. And the more we keep accepting insanity and delusion, the worse this mental health crisis is going to get. And then what? And part of the problem is you start doing research on some of these mental health groups and some of this mental health crisis, and you will read in there, and I suggest you do that on your own. You should always do your own research. And so please go to these show notes and go through these articles yourself. And you're going to see that there's an awful lot of language in there and where we're trying to actually get help to people who completely are okay with some of this insanity and delusion. So, listen, we as a society need to come together, and we need to speak, as the article I wrote last week says, we need to speak the truth in love. It is important that we speak truth. Just because everybody is saying this is true doesn't make it true. Just because Congress passed a law because half of them have lost their collective minds doesn't make it true. That in and of itself does not have anything to do with truth. Just because the Supreme Court 50 years ago can't read doesn't make it law. I mean, it makes it an opinion, and for years it may hold some weight, but it doesn't make it factual in and of itself. That's just not the way it works. Sorry. That's why these things can change and need to change, because we need to get back to truth in this country. And quite frankly, it's the only country I care about. So with that said, let me leave you with one final good thing that I hope will be a good thing, and that is that new 988 number. When we talk about suicide and we talk about mental health, that new 988 number that came out in July, I think that is a good thing. We will have to see what it leads to, but the idea is that it's a 3-digit number that someone can call if they're in need of a mental health crisis, to talk to a suicide hotline and so forth. And it's kind of the idea of a 911 call, and the proponents of it realize that by them dialing 911, the response you're often and almost always going to get is going to be law enforcement. By dialing 988, you're going to hopefully get a mental health counselor, and hopefully that is going to help ease not only what law enforcement is having to do out there, but also the safety of everybody involved. So, so far, it looks like it's going to be a really good thing, and I'm a big proponent of it and believe strongly in its potential. So that is it for this episode. I hope you got something out of it. Hopefully I didn't bore you with too many statistics. Hopefully I didn't drive you too crazy with losing my collective mind while I watch the degradation and complete disaster that is Western civilization. However, if you are enjoying this content, please go to ontheblueline.com, ontheblueline.com. Just redid the website within the last month. I hope you enjoy it. Please, I would love to hear your comments. Please comment. We are on all the social media. I'm probably most active on Instagram. I'm trying to get a little bit more active on Twitter, but Instagram by far is probably the one that I focus on the most. So I'd love to hear your comments on the episode. Also drop us an email, again, ontheblueline.com. All that information is on there, and I would love to hear from you. That's all I have this week. Until I see you next week, have a great week and be safe out there.